Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this joint Nesta and Centre for Net Zero event about our pilot project HeatFlex UK, looking at automating heat pump demand. My name is Andy Regan. I'm a mission manager in Nesta's Sustainable Future team. I look after our projects on energy flexibility and our projects in Wales. For those who don't know us, Nesta is a charitable foundation dedicated to innovation for social good. We design, test, and scale solutions to society's biggest problems. Our three missions are to help people live healthy lives, give every child a fairer start, and speed up the decarbonisation of the UK's homes. We used mixed methods approaches with in-house teams of data scientists, designers, behavioural scientists, collective intelligence specialists, arts practitioners and venture builders, and many more to drive progress across our missions. Our partners on the HeatFlex project are Centre for Net Zero, CNZ. CNZ is an impact-driven, not-for-profit research unit founded by Octopus Energy. Their work is grounded in real-world data via access to tens of billions of Octopus Energy customer data points, giving valuable insights into the real behaviours of people and businesses. While CNZ is part of the Octopus Energy Group, they operate autonomously and set their own public interest research agenda to accelerate the energy transition. Nesta and Centre for Net Zero are both interested in ensuring the future energy system is built around people. At Nesta, one of our areas of focus is energy flexibility. We want to maximise the potential for homes to play a part in this, but we also want big policy decisions to be based on realistic assumptions about its potential. And real life trials are the best way to improve those assumptions. So today we're talking about HeatFlex UK. A pilot project where we remotely controlled heat pumps to shift demand away from peak times. We monitored participants' electricity consumption and asked them for feedback on their experience. We had three key research questions. How much flexibility can we really get from heat pumps? Is third-party automation of heat acceptable to consumers? And can we understand how consumers' comfort preferences influence their home's flexibility potential? The pilot ran between January and April of this year, and we had 12 households participating in 20 events. The main purpose was to test and refine our methodology for a full-scale randomized control trial, which we aim to run in winter 23-24. But we think we've learned some interesting things in the process, which we'll share today when we get to the full presentations. Before that, just a little housekeeping. Closed captions for this event can be accessed via the LinkedIn live stream. And we'd really like to invite you in the audience to join the conversation in the comments box on the right-hand side of your screen. Please do introduce yourselves. Please ask any questions throughout the event. We'll have a Q&A section at the end. And let us know what you think. Will we be using heat pumps for flexibility in the future? And what will that look like? What other interesting research is happening in this space? And where do you think the biggest knowledge gaps are to move this agenda forward? Let us know. So I'll introduce our two speakers who've been working with me and the wider team on the project. First is Daniel Lopez Garcia, Research Manager at Centre for Net Zero. Daniel's interest lies in the intersection between energy, technology, sustainability, and human behaviour. He manages and is responsible for supporting several research areas at CNZ, spanning flexibility, energy markets, electric vehicles, heat pumps, and cities. Previously, Daniel's worked at Aurora Energy Research and Accenture, where he contributed directly to the delivery of power market forecasts for European countries, developed research about green hydrogen production, and helped develop cloud solutions for customer relationship management. Hi, Danny. Also joined by my colleague Ollie Berry from Nesta. Ollie is a behavioural scientist and senior researcher for the Sustainable Future mission. Today is his first official day at Nesta, having joined us permanently following a comment from the Behavioural Insights team. We're delighted to have him on board. He specialises in quantitative research, including impact evaluation, design, and quasi-experimental methods. Has an MSc in behavioural science from LSE and an MA in natural sciences from Cambridge, and he's led the design of key components of the HeatFlex pilot methodology. Welcome, Ollie. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to. Oh no, I'm not. I'm going to hand over to Daniel to talk a little about the intervention that we tested during HeatFlex. Over to you, Danny.
Yeah, thank you very much, Andy. So our intervention in HeatFlex, as Andy mentioned a moment ago, we were just trying to get to know what are people's preferences and how people interact with automation and heat pumps at the same time. And we were just trying to see whether there was a way in which we could maintain comfort levels while people were saving energy in a event style type of flexibility. So um, here we can see that HeatFlex uses indirect load control. This basically means that we are not asking people to directly turn off the heat pump themselves. We're doing this automatically, as Andy mentioned. So what we do is we use the Octopus Energy Research and Development app to control how the target temperature of the heat pump varies across two different windows. These windows are the preheating window and the flexibility window. In the first one, we will increase the temperature to a certain level, and then in the second one, we will decrease the temperature to a lower level, which is kind of like higher and then lower in regards to the normal levels of operation that people will have in their household. The fact that this is an event style type of flexibility means that this is not happening on a regular basis. Basically, as it happened, for example, in the demand flexibility service, we will advise people 24 hours before the event happened to opt in into the event, and they were free to opt out in case they weren't home on or they were not able to experience that intervention. Um, Here we can have an schematic of what I just explained. So basically, at certain times of the day, during 2 hours for our preheating window, we will increase the energy consumption basically by increasing the temperature that the heat pump is targeting. And this can correlate to hours in which we have, let's say, a normal demand on the grid. Then we will decrease the temperature during what we call the flexibility window, which also spans for 2 hours in most of the cases. And this correlates to periods of the day in which we have a very high demand, which also correlates to very high carbon intensity in the grid. And then after that flexibility window, we will come back to the normal operation that people were kind of like scheduling their heat pumps for. After this, it's important also to mention that this was not a trial in which we were aiming to harness the highest amount of flexibility. We were just trying to check whether flexibility was achievable whilst maintaining comfort in the household. So basically, these temperatures that I referred to, that we will kind of like increase the temperature for in the preheating window and then decrease the temperature for in the flexibility window, were elicited temperatures. So basically, we asked our participants at what temperatures they will feel comfortable, both maximum and minimum, respectively, for the preheating and then the flexibility window. So in this case, we were trying to maintain comfort while harnessing some flexibility. So the aim of the project was to see whether there is some inherent flexibility that we could get whilst people had some levels of comfort that we had to test as well, because these elicited preferences might not be then seen in the data that we are collecting from the trial itself. We also encourage participants to basically drop off of the events, so opt out in cases in where they were feeling either too warm or too cold during these preheating or flexibility windows, respectively. So an schematic of this event in terms of like the temperatures that people were facing during the events can be seen on this slide. So we will have, let's say, average temperature. This is fake data. This does not correlate with what our customers have seen on their households, because as you can see, we achieve the maximum temperature at the end of the preheating window. Obviously, this depends on different things such as levels of insulation, occupation, and different variables that might mean that we actually don't achieve the maximum temperature at the end of the preheating window, or we achieve it before, in which case we will just maintain that temperature until the end of the window. Then we will reduce that temperature during the flex window to the minimum elicited temperature, as I mentioned a moment ago. And again, we might not reach that temperature at the end of the flex window, or we might reach it way before, in which case we will maintain that temperature over time. And then when the HeatFlex event per se finishes, we will go back to the average comfort temperature that our customers had elicited in this service that I mentioned a moment ago. So we use a mixed methods to analyze how our participants experience these HeatFlex events. And basically we had access to smart meter data, which I'll explain in a second. And we also had several surveys and one-to-one interviews with our participants to basically know how they experienced these events and what was the overall kind of like sentiment and the overall feeling towards the HeatFlex intervention, as to know whether this automation in principle is acceptable and whether our customers presented some comfort levels that we could actually say were acceptable to them. So in terms of the smart meter data, we did analyze all the electricity consumption from all the 12 participants that Andy mentioned a moment ago across different events. We have to say that these 12 participants represent a varied setup. Basically, this means that some people might have access to different LCTs, such as solar panels, batteries, apart from the heat pump, obviously, electric vehicles. So it's important to mention that in some cases, for example, when people have batteries or solar panels, they might have different import and export MPANs. Basically, that means that they might be injecting electricity into the grid, not only consuming electricity. And to make it a standard for the analysis, we have ignored that export energy that might be the case for some of our participants. And this is something very important to take a look into the analysis. And also we have to acknowledge the fact that 12 participants is quite a small data set. So basically that means that it might be the case that when doing some regression analysis or doing some other types of statistical analysis on whether the intervention was successful or not, we have to acknowledge the fact that there is some statistical significance that we are losing just because we don't have enough numbers to confidently say whether consumption increased or decreased during this period. This was a pilot. We were trying to test whether things worked and whether our participants were comfortable with the intervention. So we need to take into account these small caveats to see the analysis in the proper light. Here we can see the result of the analysis. We did a regression on the consumption data from all the customers. We can see here that we had up to almost 27,000 points that we analyzed. And basically this means that for every half an hour, we will have a record of how much electricity was consumed for every single one of these participants. We had 20 events, and every single event had 4 different half-hour periods that we analyzed. So if we do the maths, we can get up to that number. And basically, what we can see on this slide is the fact that during the preheat phase, we do see an increase in consumption, but this increase in consumption is smaller compared to the decrease in consumption that we observed during the flexibility window. So even though the whiskers that we see for every single point cross the 0 boundary, that basically means that, as I mentioned a moment ago, there is not enough statistical significance. We'll need to have more participants in a larger trial to actually say this with confidence, with a statistical confidence. Regardless of this, we do see that the preheat phase actually increased consumption, but in a lower degree that the flexibility window decreases consumption. So in principle, maintaining comfort, but while doing the HeatFlex intervention decreases the amount of consumption of our participants. One might wonder whether this flexibility style or this type of flexibility event increases consumption before or after the intervention. And that is what we did in the analysis as well. We actually checked whether there was any impact on the consumption before and after the event. And as we can see here, there is not such effect for our participants. Again, we need to take into account that COVID is only 12 people that we analyze for, and there is not a statistical significance to say that. But regardless of that, the analyses are very promising. It's also important to mention that we took into account heating degree days to account for like difference in temperatures that we observe in all these different days. But as I said, it's very promising. After this, I'm gonna carry on with the survey findings. Sorry, Oli is going to carry on with the survey findings. So over to you, Oli.
Great. Thanks very much, Danny. So yeah, I'm going to first of all talk about the survey findings, which were something we wanted to do to get a bit more depth of insight from participants about how they experience the events themselves, and is I think a really important part of this study in terms of kind of finding out a bit more about why we may have got the findings we did from the smart data. So we sent online surveys to participants by email at the end of each event. And we did that for a couple of reasons. So first of all, as Danny mentioned, participants could opt out both before and during events. And we wanted to find out some of the reasons about why participants may have done this. And the second reason is really about capturing the experiences of participants themselves during the event. So we wanted to find out what participants were up to during the events, how they found the events in terms of their thermal comfort, and just to get a bit more information about how the experiences of participants might vary across different events, morning and evenings, and different times of day, etc. And one of the reasons we were interested in asking each participant was because we expected essentially there to be differences across events. So we had 159 responses to the surveys in total. We had 26 cases where participants opted out before events. And in the reasons they provided in the survey was mostly because they weren't at home or they were on holiday. And this was important because we didn't want to preheat their homes when they weren't at home and their heating might not be on. And we also had 11 instances where people opted out during the events themselves. And from the surveys, they all said that this was because they were too cold. And actually, this is quite reassuring in the sense that participants were happy to opt out and revert their heating to normal during the events themselves. So in terms of participant experience, one of the things we did at the beginning of this trial was to ask participants about what their thermal, kind of the range of temperatures they'd be thermally comfortable at. So this chart here shows responses from participants. We've got the kind of bottom of the bar, the blue part being the minimum, and the top of the bar and the orange part being the maximum. And you can see here from this chart, there's actually quite a lot of variation across participants in terms of minimum and maximum and the kind of extent of the range as well. So we were kind of aware that different participants might have different responses to when we were both preheating their homes and also during the flexibility window when the heating might not be on. So we really want to use the online surveys to capture some of these differences. And we did find that in the flexibility window itself, there was a decrease in temperature. So we wanted to use the surveys to understand about how participants found the kind of temperature at the beginning of the flexibility window, just after preheating, and also at the end of the flexibility window. And this chart here shows that the kind of change in temperature across from the start to the end of the flexibility window, so when heat pumps weren't providing heat to homes. And we did find that in general there was a decrease between 0 and 1 degree Celsius decreasing, but also display some of the differences that we kind of saw when it comes to temperature changes. So some homes actually increased in heat very, very slightly, which we think may be due to some kind of thermal lag in radiators. And we do also have one incident where a participant's home increased during the flexibility window, which we found out from the surveys was because they used a log burner during the flexibility window itself. So it's good to do these kinds of surveys to find out about what may have been happening during the actual window itself. So when it came to thermal preferences and thermal comfort, which was something we were keen to maintain during the intervention, this slide shows how participants responded about their thermal comfort at the beginning and the end of the flexibility window. The main takeaway from this slide is that the majority of participants were comfortable or very comfortable at the beginning and the end of the flexibility window, which suggests we were able to maintain thermal comfort in most of the cases. And this chart is a Sankey diagram. It also shows how responses changed per participant from the beginning to the end of the flexibility window. So the kind of grey line indicates how each participant may have responded. And also it's fair to say that in the majority of cases, participants' thermal comfort was the same at the beginning and the end of the window itself. We do see some small number of instances where thermal comfort changed. So, for example, you can see there's one change where the rating went from uncomfortable to very comfortable at the end, and that actually was the case where there was the log burner. And it really suggests why kind of asking participants directly about their experience is important, because this helps demonstrate some of the reasons why we saw the results we did for the smart meter data. So the next part I'm going to talk about is the user research. So this was the kind of third data collection part we had for our mixed methods study. We, as Danny set out, we actually interviewed participants, or a handful of participants, on their experiences during the events. We actually used floor plans as a way of helping guide these interviews. So we worked with a handful of participants on kind of just mapping out what the floor plans of their homes look like, which I'll show you in the next few slides. And this included things like where their radiators were, where the smart thermostat was, and kind of where the doorways were, etc., to their home. And this really helped us understand contextual information about what happened during the events, so how participants behaved, but also to understand a bit more about each participant's home itself. And this was really important because we had, although we only had 12 participants, each participant's home was quite different, and it meant that even across, there was quite a varied response about like how homes responded during the preheating phase and the flexibility window itself. So to kind of bring this to light, this next slide shows a very simplified floor plan, and it kind of shows some of the assumptions about how our intervention would work as effectively as we would have hoped it to do. So this is a schematic of a floor plan, and there are a few assumptions here about how like the ideal home or a kind of very simple home would behave. So this includes things like there being free airflow throughout the home, and also building fabric being the same. This would result in the temperature across the home being the same, which means that when we had our preheating phase, all the rooms would heat up the same. And then during the flexibility window, because of the fabric being the same, all homes would kind of lower in temperature the same as well. This would be the ideal, most clean way of our intervention working. However, as we found from the interviews, the reality of implementing our intervention in different homes was quite a lot different. So I think on the next slide, we've got an example of a floor plan from one of the participants. And this demonstrates how actually the kind of complexity from implementing our intervention in the real world. So they, in the kind of blue shaded room, their lounge is where they had the smart thermostat. And they actually had all their doors closed, or tended to keep all the doors closed in their home. And the lounge itself actually cooled off quite a lot quicker than the rest of their home. So it meant that during the preheating phase, the smart thermostat was actually calling for heat based on the temperature in the lounge, which was cooler, which meant that the rest of the home actually increased in heat above the preheat temperature, such to the extent that the participants actually had to turn down the temperature setting on their radiators to prevent the rest of their home from heating up too much. So this is just an example about how actually the reality of our intervention was quite different to what the kind of simplified idea of it would have been. This is on the next slide is another floor plan. So this is also a participant's actual home that we mapped out with them through the interviews. And one of the interesting parts we gathered from this research, this interview, is that the participants actually moved their smart thermostat with them depending on where they were at home. So, for example, in the morning events that we ran, which occurred from kind of around 5 a.m. to 9 a.m., they tended to have their smart thermostat with them in the bedroom to kind of control the heat in the bedroom. And interestingly, they had actually set their radiator in their bedroom to a lower temperature than the maximum they'd provide us with, while the rest of their home kind of didn't have this restriction on their radiators. And this meant that the rest of their home actually preheated above the maximum temperature they provided, even though their bedroom remained cool because of the low temperature set on their radiators. So once again, demonstrating the complexity about implementing our intervention in the real world. And I think these floor plans demonstrate the importance of kind of using a mixed methods approach, so using qualitative interviews and surveys in addition to the smart data analysis, because really from the smart meter data you get a very kind of accurate kind of estimate of what the flexibility is, but it doesn't present some of the complexity that is actually occurs when you implement in the real world. So yeah, this is very interesting findings, and the other thing is we plan on improving our intervention, the second phase, based on some of this research. So yeah, that's the end of my section. I think I'm going to pass over to Andy for the wrap up.
Thanks, Ollie. So I'll just whiz through this very quickly, just to kind of really sum up what we think are the absolute headline findings of the pilot. Firstly, that our intervention basically seems to work within some quite noisy data. We saw, as Daniel said, a trend of increased consumption in the preheat phase and decreased consumption in the turn down period, which is what you would expect. Secondly, participants broadly seem to find the automated control acceptable, and the negative feedback was mostly to do with the app that we've been using, which was still under development. And thirdly, we saw fairly low levels of opt-outs, with only those 11 occasions that Ollie mentioned where participants overrode our control because they were too cold. As we've all emphasised throughout, this was a pilot with a small sample, so we're making no claims at this point as to whether these are generalisable findings. But the pilot has given us confidence that we're testing what we want to test, and that running the trial of scale will give us answers to our questions. So just a little more about what the key differences will be in what we're thinking of as HeatFlex 2. Absolute primary outcome measure will be the kilowatt turn down that we've achieved during the flexibility window compared to the baseline. We'll monitor the consumption across those different periods, as Daniel mentioned, and it will be a randomized control trial where we will have, we hope, a control group of other customers who are not participating, who we can make a comparison with. The other key difference from our point of view was we will have asset level monitoring of the actual heat pumps in phase 2 of the trial, so that we can better separate that data from the smart meter level data. And what that will really give us is something that looks like this, completely faked up data here, just showing the kind of comparisons across the different periods. We'll be able to have sub-analyses by various other characteristics of interest, obvious ones being, EPC ratings of the homes, although obviously, as the floor plan discussion shows us, that itself can be somewhat misleading. We'll understand more about household makeup, location, etc. But this is the sort of thing that we hope to be reporting on at the end of phase 2, again, kind of complemented by all that feedback directly from participants. Some contact details there that I'll leave on screen for a moment if anyone wants to follow up with Ollie and Danny as the 2 project leads for phase 2 afterwards. And there's a generic inbox that we all get messages from. And that's the upfront presentations. So as I say, we'll be opening up the event for questions from the audience towards the end. And please do use the comments box to add your questions. Before we do that, we have 2 guest speakers who I'm delighted to introduce, be sharing their reflections on the project and the wider context about heat flexibility research. Really happy to be joined by Adam Smith from the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero. He works on securing the UK supply chain for heat pumps and their components through the Heat Pump Investment Accelerator, which aims to encourage manufacturers to invest in the UK and expand the UK's capacity to domestically produce heat pumps. He's also working on how we encourage the introduction of smart heating devices, including through regulation to benefit from consumers, industry and energy networks. Hi, Adam. Thanks for joining us today. We're also joined by Jenny Crawley, who's a research fellow in the Energy and Buildings Unit at UCL Energy Institute. She's also the UCL academic manager for the EPSRC-funded Centres for Doctoral Training in Energy Demand, LOLO, and Energy Resilience and the Built Environment, ERBE. She works on the built environment aspects of the transition to a low carbon energy system, heating, cooling, flexibility, and building performance. And her research interests include the design and execution of socio-technical research into domestic energy use and analysis and interpretation of energy data, and has been a really helpful supporter of the HeatFlex project from very early on. So delighted to have her joining us today. So welcome both of you. Thanks for coming to the event. Adam, a couple of questions to start with you, really. Like, part of the motivation for doing HeatFlex obviously is to understand like what sort of intervention might work, but we're also interested in kind of providing information that's useful to decision makers like DESNZ and Ofgem and others. Can you just tell us a little more about your current priorities in the department in terms of policy development around flexibility and domestic flexibility specifically?
Yeah, sure, no problem. So I think most of our focus is actually on domestic flexibility at the moment, more than anything else. So really, at the moment, a lot of the effort's going into enabling the devices to facilitate this sort of behaviour. So really, we're working at the moment on working towards our second consultation around what we will mandate devices to be able to do. So we're particularly looking at heat pumps, storage heaters, and heat batteries, and also with an eye on hybrid heat pumps, and also hot water storage and generation, in terms of those being the main technologies that we think we're going to focus on first to be able to provide this level of flexibility. And we're currently working on what standards we're going to require of those devices, and how consumers are going to interact with them. One of the big things that we've been thinking about is we can provide the technology, we can mandate the technology to enable these things, but what the big critical part is whether consumers will actually use them, whether they're comfortable using them, or whether we have a lot of devices that have a potential to provide all this flexibility but aren't actually being taken up. So understand there's a lot of questions out there about, are consumers happy to be warmer than they would normally like? Are they happy to be perhaps slightly cooler than they would normally like to either save money or be rewarded for taking part in these events? So it's been really useful to start to get a feel for what consumers may or may not be prepared to tolerate in this area.
Thanks, Adam. Yeah, and on the kind of the point about the smart mandate and ensuring kind of standards for what you're going to require, certainly one of the things that we found a kind of a interesting learning point in implementing the HeatFlex pilot was some of the technical barriers that we encountered. So we had more than 12 households who were willing to participate, and we learned a bit about the challenges of kind of getting bits of tech to talk to each other. And obviously we were trying to implement an intervention that was automated. It wasn't something where the participants were kind of having to do much themselves. I'm interested in what your general reflections are on the work we've done so far. Whether I could kind of tempt you to make any predictions about what you think we might find, and perhaps where you think the balance between like automated methods like the one that we've tested and kind of maybe more manual things where participants or householders, we should say, kind of actually making decisions to like manually shift their demand. Where do you think the balance is perhaps going to be between those two things in the future energy system?
Yeah, sure. So I suppose, yeah, on that interop, that like accessibility of devices and stuff, that's definitely part of what we're trying to address, is to make sure that everyone has the ability to be able to take part. It's not just going to be, as obviously going forward, that'll be. In terms of that balance, I think our focus is very much on, we're expecting most of it to come from an automated level rather than a manual level. We want to enable people to still be able to do, if they feel comfortable or want to be involved in their heating system, we still want them to be able to do that. We don't want to take away their choice, and that will always be a primary primary factor in this, that consumers will always have the choice on what they want to do. But we definitely want to enable that automated level of response, that the system can start to take control of these things without people hopefully having any real notice of what their heating system is doing, apart from they keep warm to whatever level they want to do. So we're really focused on that automated side.
What do you think are the kind of biggest unknowns for you at this point as a department trying to make decisions for the long term? What would you want to see from our project or from other future research in this space to sort of reduce that uncertainty and build your confidence in the direction of travel?
I think really where our biggest questions always is around that consumer acceptance piece. We model what we think we can hopefully save the network in terms of costs and reinforcing, but that does depend on people taking up these opportunities to either be reduce their costs or be paid to take part in events, or just take part because they feel obligated to do so as part of that, whatever it is. So really understanding whether what we assume people's uptake of the systems will be really is the key part, and whether they are happy to do so, and then the biggest outcome being, are we actually saving any energy? Are we actually shifting a significant amount of energy like we assume we will do? Or are we going to end up in a situation where to preheat homes to keep people comfortable, we end up potentially consuming more electricity than we're saving in the flexibility events? That would obviously not, that's something we need to really dial into to make sure we are getting to what we think should happen.
Yeah, and I suppose ultimately whether that trade-off's worth it to have a kind of a net increase, but actually shaving the peaks is, it's not always necessarily the case that one is better or best. So thanks Adam, and we'll obviously come back to you again during the Q&A. So anybody in the audience, please do submit questions directly for Adam and Jenny, as well as the HeatFlex team. So Jenny, again, welcome. Thanks for coming back, and thanks for your support to the project throughout. Interested in your reflections on the pilot. Now you've heard more about it. Was there anything in particular that kind of jumped out at you that we've perhaps not touched on in the presentations?
Great, thanks. So the HeatFlex pilot is situated within a body of research that's going on at the moment on heating flexibility, but I think the pilot really adds in a few key areas. So that's what I wanted to bring out. And the first is the preheating aspect, which I think is really interesting and isn't something that's being tried in kind of every trial that's going on. And I think preheating might turn out to be quite important if we want to extend the amount of time we can turn heat pumps off, or to limit the temperature drop when we do turn them off. And I think there's been some very interesting social and technical findings from HeatFlex so far. So in terms of the social findings, the different acceptability of preheating at different times of day. So you've been showing how preheating in the morning is less acceptable than preheating later on in the day. And there has been previous work on kind of nighttime preheating and some of the problems this causes, but I don't think anyone's done a kind of direct time of day comparison before. And it really brings out to me that we might have to do different demand shifting strategies at different times of day. And then on the technical side, various bits of the heating system, including thermostatic radiator valves, have been shown by your team to be possibly getting in the way of some of this stuff, like, for example, limiting preheating. And I think this really adds to the body of evidence on how the entire heating system has to work together to really get the result that you intend. And then just the other thing I was interested in mentioning was this floor plan analysis that Ollie was talking about, really showing that not all rooms in one home are the same. And if you control the load shifting from a single room, then which room it is can really affect what happens. For example, if it's a fast warming room, then the other rooms might not preheat as much as they could, or vice versa. I think this really raises questions as to how to get this right for the household, but also for the intended response from the heat pump.
Yeah, thanks, Jenny. Thanks for pulling those extra things out. As I say, I should mention our full report is being published on Thursday, which covers a lot more than we've been able to kind of cram in today. One of the interesting thoughts that the research has prompted for me is who and what kind of households and householders are more likely to be offering flexibility. So on your point around TRVs kind of getting in the way of our intervention, I think some of our participants tend to the kind of super users, very like high tech, quite bespoke systems in some of the homes who joined the trial. And an open question in our minds is whether those users are the best place to be participating in kind of automated demand flex where someone else is controlling it, or whether actually the sort of solution that we're trialing is perhaps more suitable for people who are less engaged and have put less kind of time and effort into speccing up their home. Going to be interested to sort of see what we find in the next phase. You've been pulling together what you described as like a shared vision for heat pump flexibility with a really wide range of stakeholders and relevant people, along with colleagues at the Centre for Research into Energy Demand Solutions. I'm interested in what you've kind of concluded so far from that piece of work and what's next for it.
Yeah, and I think this really ties into some of the things that have come out this morning from the HeatFlex. So there's broad consensus amongst the stakeholders that we've been kind of collecting this information from, that probably most heat pumps are expected to participate in flexibility in some way, and that as Adam was saying, it's expected that it will be automated. It's also very important that it doesn't affect thermal comfort negatively, or provision of hot water, because they're the two things a heat pump is there for. And the amount of flexibility we can get will be bounded very much by this. And also it's been coming out that from the research that's going on, that thermal comfort is different for everybody, and their kind of envelope of what's acceptable is different for everyone. So it's really important that this is worked out at a household level and not just pre-decided by an energy service provider or an energy company. So that's kind of broadly what it kind of might look like as it becomes more widespread, but it relies on some key assumptions, which are definitely not things we can take for granted, where I think we need some more work. So one of these was Adam's point about high levels of customer acceptance, so making it work for different sorts of households, as you were saying, Andy, making it worth it for them financially and making it the cheapest and probably the easiest way to run the heat pump. And secondly, on the technical side, what I mentioned earlier about heat pumps and heating systems correctly interacting. And sometimes the research is showing that a heat pump might be trying to do one thing, run flexibly, but then it gets overridden by a different bit of the heating system. So how to make this reliably work over a large amount of different kind of configurations is, I think, a challenge.
Thanks, Jenny. I'm just going to finally, before we kind of open up more to the audience for Q&A and get Danny and Ollie back on, I'm just going to invite you to sort of give a shout out, if you like, to any other research that people attending might be interested in, including your own. You obviously a much better overview of everything that's going on. What other trials would you suggest people look into?
Okay, well, at the moment, there's some really great stuff coming out of Southampton University, which is a bit different to this because the heat pumps were set off to turn off without people noticing, and they're really trying to test the boundaries of what people will accept or without noticing, which I think is a really crucial part of the jigsaw. So keep an eye on that. I think that's really exciting. And then there's the Equinox trial, which is being led by National Grid electricity distribution, where they've been kind of trying manual versus automated shifting, actually, with a kind of view that perhaps not everybody's going to accept automated remote control of heat pumps in the future. So they're kind of testing the manual option as well. And then in the UCL side, we're looking at buildings and what can buildings do and how can the building thermal mass itself act as a store, and how much can that kind of maintain heat pumps being turned up or down or on or off. So that's kind of some of what's out there at the moment.
Yeah, lots for interested people to look into. So I'm going to welcome Ollie and Danny back onto the screen, and forgive me, just to make sure I can properly give people a chance, I'm actually just going to pause and not say anything for a few seconds while I look at some of the questions that we've had. So forgive the dead air for a second. So I think one of the first questions I'll perhaps pick out, and I might invite Adam to comment on this one from a kind of like policy level perspective. Somebody's asking about financial benefits offered to households. So we, within the HeatFlex trial, we didn't offer a kind of per event incentive. We wanted to just kind of, as Danny said earlier, almost look at like what the lower bound of flexibility that you can achieve if you treat comfort as paramount, and not try and like tempt people to compromise their comfort for money, if you like. But obviously demand flexibility service and other sort of interventions like that potentially incentivize people to go a bit further. So have you any thoughts, Adam, on what sort of financial incentive, perhaps what level of financial incentive might be a factor in the future system? £3 for a kilowatt hour in DFS to me feels a bit high. It might be lower in a kind of business as usual scenario, and perhaps automated solutions might mean that people are not like directly exposed to those kind of system operator level price signals. So I'm interested in what you think that might look like in a business as usual scenario.
Yeah, I mean, I think where we've very much leaving it to the market on that, depending on what activities people are prepared to opt into. So it might be that some people are very happy to be more passive in their engagement with flexibility. So it might be something like time of use tariffs, that they just shift their flexibility through time of use tariffs and they get slightly reduced bills. So it's more saving money than earning money. Whereas there are some services, some of the quicker response services that might be required, where people can actually be actively rewarded for that. And really, we're mostly focusing on leaving the market to decide what reward they need for that flexibility, rather than any expectation of particular values for certain services.
But I mean, would you sort of broadly expect £3 to be a fair representation of it, or does it feel like that's perhaps just a proof of concept rate, and the real amount might be lower, or is it just not clear?
I think at the moment it's not particularly clear. The UK's not got the most developed market in terms of flexibility, so I think it's quite unclear at the moment where we might settle in terms of financial reward for different activities.
Okay, thanks, Adam. So I think someone's asked a question about comparisons with the Equinox trial. Richard Lowe's asked comparisons between this trial and Equinox. So we've had conversations with the Equinox team, and both able to kind of meet at an event that Jenny hosted. I think obviously they've actually run their trial at scale, which we're just about to do. So it would be really interesting to compare the findings. Obviously, we want to replicate trials rather than duplicate. The main difference, I think, which I think Ollie or Danny may have mentioned this in passing, we are preheating as a component of all our events, which they're not doing, and all of our events are automated. So we are testing a slightly different intervention, but fundamentally both looking really closely at heat pumps specifically. So that's hopefully says a little on that one. George Dawes has asked, how were the preheating events selected? Were they random? So that we didn't try and align with anything specific that was happening at the grid level during the pilot, because we were, as I say, the main purpose of what we've done is to test basically whether we could actually do this research at scale. So they coincided with when you would usually expect an evening peak, and therefore for carbon intensity to peak, but we didn't try and tie it too closely to real world conditions during the actual trial. Roy Matthews has asked, has any analysis been done from the pilot on the carbon savings, mapping this to the grid intensity during the flex periods alongside the consumption changes? I mean, that slightly follows on from what I was just saying. We didn't try kind of and directly link it to it. Obviously, thinking in the long term in terms of modelling and pathways for net zero, actually understanding the flexibility potential for heat pumps is going to be an important input to understanding whether how you could model those carbon savings. But I think the key thing is that a lot of the assumptions that, for example, the Climate Change Committee and DESNZ are making about the overall carbon intensity of the future system already assumes that lots of heat pumps are providing flexibility to quite a high level. So it's back to my point earlier about kind of being realistic about it. We are curious as to whether providing people with feedback on how much carbon they may have saved during a particular turn down event might increase or decrease buy-in. We can't guarantee that we'll do that in the trial, but we are definitely kind of curious about it, and we've looked at it in some of our other work. Forgive me, I'm just browsing through some of the questions. There's a question here for Adam from Will Seward. Is there a rough target date for when regulation may come in for smart heating requirements?
Yeah, so we're looking at around 2026 at the moment when we think they'll come in. Probably, yeah, we're looking to consult early 2024 on what devices we're going to mandate, what we're going to require of them, and who's going to be required to do it. And then we'll obviously move on from there. But it'll probably come in around 2026 is the target for that.
Thanks, Adam. That's helpful. I'm looking at a question from Jennifer Quinton Chelly, which is around older retired social housing tenants and private tenants need to be warmed 24/7, as many have arthritis, might be waiting for knee and hip replacements, and obviously other health conditions essentially that can be affected by heat and cold. I might ask Jenny and perhaps Danny to give some reflections on this question. So within the HeatFlex trial, we didn't we were kind of careful about who we kind of onboarded to make sure that people were not, you know, in that situation in the trial. But I think it speaks to a broader point about like the fairness of flexibility if it is going to be incentivized. So I suppose the question for both of you is what research you're aware of, or what research CNZ may have planned to think about how to make kind of heat flexibility fair across the income spectrums and across the spectrum of people with different needs. Yeah, Jenny, do you want to go first?
I'll start. I think this is potentially the beauty of preheating, this exact example. For some kind of future heat pump users, we won't be able to let the temperature drop below a certain amount, but that's not to say it can't at first raise and then kind of drop back to where it was. So potentially this will allow this group of people to join in, at least until the temperature kind of gets back to kind of where it started. For others who need kind of a more stable temperature, one thing we haven't talked about is how to incorporate other technologies, kind of like extra thermal storage, and how to or even insulation. There are kind of other technical options that will allow people to participate in flexibility, even if we can't have the temperatures going up and down as much as in other households. But obviously all of these come at a cost. And I really, don't think we've got our heads around kind of how to create the fairest way of doing it, and how much are we going to rely on technologies and how much are we going to rely on kind of people being willing. And if they can't, then how much should they then rely on technologies? And what is all this going to cost as well?
Yeah, just to on top of that, and slightly tangent to the question, this is a concept that Jenny is very familiar with. It's called flexibility capital. Actually, it's one thing that we have fed into CrowdFlex, which is another flexibility trial that CNZ is involved with. Basically, that means that if there is some people out there providing that flexibility overall to the grid, everybody benefits from those from that flexibility that has been provided. So basically everybody will get access to cheaper electricity rates, and therefore more affordable ways to kind of like heat their homes and be kept at a temperature that is comfortable to them and is kind of like suitable for their needs. So it's tangent to the question and adds a little bit onto the topic itself. But yeah, as Jenny just mentioned, I think there is not a fair solution to kind of like, be provided to people in those conditions.
Thanks, Danny. I think the next question, it doesn't explicitly follow on from it, but I think it relates. So this is a question from Dan. Did you consider the thermal mass of the properties? If it has a higher thermal mass or is more insulated, preheating will likely be more successful, which of course makes sense, and we'll probably get some better understanding of that because we'll be recording information about EPCs in the larger scale trial. I'm interested in perhaps Ollie could reflect on this one, whether we would perhaps also expect there to be a correlation between the EPC point and fairness and in terms of who lives in what kind of homes, and what the relationship between a well-insulated home that perhaps retains more heat may actually be less able to provide flexibility. What might your expectations be about that, Ollie?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I definitely think there's likely to be some kind of correlation in terms of like household income and EPC. So I think it's something we plan on looking into for the main trial. And obviously one of the limitations of the pilot is we had quite a limited sample size, whereas for the main RCT plan having many more households, which means we'll be able to actually start to see how the flexibility varies between different homes with different EPC levels. So something actually we hopefully will be able to demonstrate empirically that actually there is this kind of also correlation between EPC and flexibility feature itself.
Thanks, Ollie. I'm going to ask another question from Dr. Jason Palmer, as asking, other things being equal, wouldn't expect lower overall energy use from preheat, flex period, and recovery period. And Jason would expect that to be higher because of the heat loss during the pre and post periods. So I think, and it feels our slides imply that we're expecting this. So I think we're not necessarily expecting it. I think as Danny will have said in talking through the slides, that's very much like the sort of platonic ideal of how the intervention would work on paper. I think it's sort of implicitly how it works in some of the modelling that's done for kind of future demand and potential of flexibility. So I don't think we have a kind of hypothesis about what the mechanism for overall savings would be. I think it would relate back to the previous points about the overall kind of thermal efficiency of the building and what else is going on there. So just to clarify that we're not necessarily predicting that. And obviously the key point will then be whether that potential net increase or net decrease is worth the trade-off of kind of peak shaving and peak shifting and things like that. There is a question from Ed Badham, which I might put to Jenny based on some of the engagement around the heat pump flexibility vision. So Ed is asking, do you have any insights from distribution network operators on how open they are to integrating flexibility into their planning for grid upgrades and approvals for new connections? So we've heard a little about that. The Equinox project is a DNO-led project, so they're very much interested in it and are going to be given more of a remit to sort of procure flexibility alongside other things that will get the network to net zero. But Jenny, just interested in what you've kind of personally heard by engaging with DNOs.
Okay, sure. I think, yeah, obviously the best thing to do is get their view and not my view. But from the discussions we've had, flexibility is one out of a series of options, and sometimes it might be cheaper to reinforce a network. Sometimes it might be cheaper to plan flexibility. From what I've heard, for kind of new build areas, they're not relying on flexibility. They're speccing it kind of as if there won't be, but that might not be every DNO. That's just what I've heard. So flexibility is one out of a number of options on the table.
Makes sense. So there's not quite a kind of emerging consensus then from what I've been hearing. I'm going to sort of see who wants to answer this question, but I might ask Danny to kind of go first and see if anyone else wants to come in. Will Seward is asking, do you have an idea of where the value will come from for HeatFlex? What sort of market mechanisms will provide the value for heat flexibility? Will it be time of use tariffs, use of system charging, demand flexibility? Obviously, Danny, you sit within the Octopus Energy Group. Some kind of products are being developed around this, as well as the research that you're doing in the Centre for Net Zero. What's your best prediction about how people will actually get their kind of the rewards for providing flexibility?
Yeah, I think that there is not a straightforward answer to this. I think, as with most of things, kind of like a mix and match is a variety of different different things that can provide that value from the flexibility that you get from heat pumps. Obviously, it has like a very strong geographical component. It's not the same living in Scotland where you have a lot of wind available and there is not many constraints on the grid, than living in London where you might have a smaller house with like not a lot of room to kind of like have a heat pump. So it obviously depends on many components. I guess that if we really want to tackle flexibility and get the most out of it, and let people also make money and benefit from those solutions, we have to study this in a very case by case basis. I know that I'm not answering your question, but yeah, it doesn't really have a straightforward solution. I think it's a combination of everything. There are like a lot of suppliers out there offering different tariffs for different types of heating systems. You also have demand flexibility service that operates in a national level. You also have other trials that are specific for different areas. Jenny, for example, mentioned Southampton before. You also have Equinox, which is based in 4 DNO regions. It really depends. I think it has to be a combination of different things. You also have other initiatives as the zero home bills. Basically, these people are paying nothing for their bills, and this comes from a combination of time of use tariffs, different technology packs, and it's very geographically constrained. So yeah, sorry for not being able to give you a super precise answer, but it's a combination of everything.
I think your answer just highlights, Danny, why we need lots more research in this space to sort of be clear where it's coming from. So slightly unkind of me to single you out. And would anyone else want to sort of venture a prediction about where the value is going to come from, or should I move on to another question? No one's taking the bait. Okay, no predictions today. Ollie likes to make predictions, but he's choosing not to do so on this occasion. So I'm going to look at a question from Kate de Selincourt, who's asking, did you or will you in phase 2 check how well set up the systems are, in particular what the overall capacity of the emitters are? She imagines that would have a bearing on how well it works. So I'll have a go at answering this one. So I think we're not currently planning to do it with that level of kind of detail in phase 2, though I completely accept the premise that it's really important to understand that. Partly that's just logistics. We're hoping to have several hundred customers participating in phase 2, and it's not really kind of plausible to do that level of assessment, though we will capture some information up front about what's going on in the homes, EPCs, and what sort of systems are in place there. Do they have batteries? Do they have storage? We've also considered whether in phase 2 we might offer some coaching to the participants, whether that would be a worthwhile thing to do. So again, as Ollie was setting out when talking about the floor plans, we think we've potentially learned some things about suggestions we could make to participants about how to optimize their homes during the HeatFlex events. And as it stands, we're not currently planning to do that, make that a feature of the trial. Part of the reason for that is, again, I think we're interested in establishing, if you like, the lower bound of the flexibility potential. So if you do something which is sort of launched as a mass market, like low support version of an intervention, so we're not really helping or coaching people to sort of provide the maximum flexibility possible. We're just trying to keep it within the comfort window. What sort of level of turn down can you achieve, and is that worth it? And I think the assumption there would be that anything you then do on top in terms of optimizing the system or bits of coaching, suggesting that people take the smart thermostat to bed with them or whatever it might be to kind of optimize the turn down, you can only assume that the higher bound is higher than what we would perhaps come out with in the HeatFlex 2 trial. So absolutely right to say that that will optimize how well it works, but for practical and kind of methodological reasons, we're not really necessarily thinking about doing that in phase 2 at the moment. As I just kind of browse some of the other questions, were there any questions perhaps from Jenny to the project team or Adam to the project team about the trial, or any other comments from either of you on the panel, as I just look at the audience questions a little more closely.
I just wanted to pick up on Jason's point about the total energy use, and I think he's got a point, but I think it would be even maybe there's an extra factor here, which is that the heat pumps will work less efficiently if they are working hard to preheat and then doing nothing and then working hard again, potentially to restore a temperature afterwards. And it's quite a new way of thinking about heat pump energy use, is that energy use is I think quite likely to go up. We don't know how much, and in the work I've done, it actually hasn't gone up, but it might go up. And it's a very different way, because we're always thinking about how to keep energy use down, aren't we? And so the financial structures and tariffs might have to be in place to incentivize heat pumps to be used kind of outside of peak times, which also account for the fact that heat pumps might not be as efficient if they're being run in this way. And I'm not sure if this is something that your participants in the phase 2 are going to notice, kind of any effect on their bills, but it'd be something to really kind of keep a track of.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm interested in just digging into the efficiency point. I guess thinking about it from the heat pump manufacturer perspective and heat pump installer perspective, I've heard some skepticism about whether this is the optimal way to use heat pumps, or whether we even should do it, or they're designed to run at a kind of consistently low temperature throughout the day, and there seem to be concerns about losing efficiency by turning them on and off, or even in some cases people being concerned about heat pumps being damaged, or reducing their kind of operational life by using them in this way. I mean, what do you think there's a consensus kind of emerging from the engagement that you've done around that question, or is it another area where we should be trying to kind of grow our understanding of the impact on the heat pump unit of doing this?
For me,
yes, Jenny, sorry.
Yeah. It seems to be that if it's done properly by somebody that kind of knows what they're doing, it shouldn't damage the life of a heat pump. There shouldn't be that many on and off, or anything kind of really that's making it work outside of its normal bounds. But it is likely to decrease efficiency overall. And I think while there's been a lot of modelling in that area, there haven't been as many kind of empirical trials of how much it's going to increase heat pump electricity use, and how much the financial incentives have to kind of account for that, so that people actually don't end up paying more to use a heat pump in a less efficient way. But actually there's a bit of a change of kind of mindset about it. So saying, well, it is operating in the most efficient way for the carbon, but perhaps not the electricity demand in it. And it's a bit of a different way of thinking, I think.
Thanks, Jenny. So again, hopefully we'll have another event in a few years where we know the definite answer to all of these questions, and HeatFlex will play a role in that. I think we're kind of come to the end of the questions that we can answer. Lots of people have been asking things around the thermal inertia and broader points about fairness and how this can be done in a way that ensures well-being. And I think we're all very mindful of that in doing the research. But I think I might just start to wrap us up and let people know what's coming next. So thanks everyone, Adam, Jenny, Danny and Ollie, for a really interesting discussion and all of our audience questions. I hope it's kind of useful and interesting and whet your appetites for what we will find in phase 2. Now we've reached the end of the event, I'd be really grateful if those joining us in the audience could just fill in a short survey, which will be shared in the chat and is available in the events description. As a thank you for filling out the survey, you'll be entered into a prize draw to win a £50 bookshop.org voucher. If you haven't already, please sign up for the Nesta newsletter and the CNZ newsletter, and we'll let you know about the other events that we have coming up. The full report of the pilot and the early findings will be published on the Nesta and Centre for Net Zero websites this Thursday, the 14th, and we'll be publishing regular updates on the project as we go forward. I'd just like to again thank our speakers today, particularly Adam and Jenny for joining us, and obviously Ollie and Danny for presenting the work. like to thank the wider project team across both organisations: Max Woolard, Andy Marsden, Davinia Kiley, Maria Jacob, Ryan Jenkinson, Andrew Shine, Phil Steele, Katie King, and Lucy Yu for all the hard work on the project. And I'd particularly like to say thank you to the participants in the pilot of the trial, some of whom I believe may have joined us today in the audience. Really appreciate the kind of generosity with the time and the filling in the surveys and allowing us to trusting us to sort of responsibly take control of the heat pump units. It's been really valuable work, and we've really kind of valued the extent to which some of you went above and beyond actually what we'd asked for and provided us with lots more information than we could ever have hoped for. So that's it. Thanks for joining us today at the event, and look forward to hopefully joining you all again at the end of the next phase to tell you what we have found. Thanks very much.